What if I told you there was a cat raised by two German shepherds who didn't just survive, but saved a man's life? Not once, but in a way no one in town could explain. She didn't bark, she didn't beg. But when her human collapsed one winter night, she did something no one expected. From a dog, let alone a cat. Her name is Junie. And by the end of this story, you might not see loyalty the same way again. If this already sparks something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. A late November wind drifted across the farmlands of Elmridge, Montana, biting through rows of bare apple trees and whistling low across rusted fences. The skies hung low with pewter clouds, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and frozen earth. Just off a gravel road lined with frostbitten weeds sat an old farmhouse shaded by two towering spruce trees. The wood was gray from years of weathering, the porch creaked with every gust, and the windows glowed dimly with a yellow warmth that promised nothing but silence. Walter Briggs, 70 years old, stood at the window watching the sky. He was a tall, wiry man with a thin face and weathered skin marked by sun and sorrow. His eyes, pale blue like early frost, had lost their sharpness, softened by the ache of memory. His back hunched slightly from years of work and grief. Once a beloved veterinarian in the region, Walter had withdrawn from the world since the fire that took his wife and teenage daughter 3 winters ago. He rarely left the house now except for supplies and firewood. The only voices that ever spoke in his home belonged to 2 animals, his constant shadows. Max and Duke were identical twin German shepherds, both 6 years old, with thick sable coats that darkened along their backs and lightened to golden along their legs. Max was the more reserved of the 2, with eyes that studied everything and a stillness that made strangers pause. Duke, by contrast, held a joyful glint in his eyes, often bounding ahead with a tail that seemed incapable of stillness. They were fiercely loyal to Walter, never leaving his side and sleeping one on each side of his bed like silent guards. That afternoon, as a cold drizzle began to fall, Walter stirred from his chair with a grunt and reached for his flannel coat. He hadn't planned to go out, but Max and Duke had been pacing near the door for the past 10 minutes, ears perked, alert in a way that told Walter something wasn't right. He pulled on his boots, the kind with cracked leather and fraying laces, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind slapped at his face as the dogs trotted down the steps ahead of him, noses in the air. He followed them across the overgrown yard, past the fence, toward the old Sinclair gas station that had been boarded up for years. There was no traffic out this way, just wind and rust. Max stopped first, ears back. Duke growled low in his throat, then whined. Walter squinted beneath the brim of his hat and spotted a flash of movement near a tipped-over trash bin. He stepped closer. There, barely larger than a clump of wet leaves, was a kitten, drenched and trembling. Her fur was a muted silver with faint smoky swirls. Her tail curled tightly around her side. Her ears, uniquely curled backward in the shape of a question mark, marked her as an American curl, though Walter hadn't seen one in years. Her eyes, large, round, and amber, met his with a stillness that startled him. She didn't hiss, she didn't cry, she simply watched. Walter bent down slowly, bones protesting, and spoke gently. "What the hell are you doing out here, little one?" He glanced at Max, who had crept forward, and now sniffed the air around the kitten with his steady, solemn demeanor. Then came Duke, tail wagging slowly, posture curious but calm. Walter expected the kitten to bolt, but instead, she did something that made his chest tighten. She reached one delicate paw and touched Duke's nose. A breath caught in Walter's throat. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Looks like you're coming home with us." He peeled off his coat and wrapped the tiny body gently, feeling the bones beneath the fur, the rapid heartbeat against his hand. She was light as a breath and just as fragile. Back at the farmhouse, Walter dried her with an old towel, then lined a wicker basket with an extra blanket and set it beside the fireplace. Max lay down immediately on one side of it, tail curled tight. Duke rested on the other side and dropped a rubber ball nearby as if to say, "Welcome." The kitten didn't resist. She curled against the blanket, eyes still wide but no longer afraid. Walter stood over them for a long moment. "You two sure about this?" he asked softly, though neither dog looked away. The fire crackled gently. Outside, the rain thickened into sleet. Inside, a strange warmth began to grow, one that hadn't touched the house in years. He poured some warm milk into a shallow saucer and placed it beside the basket. The kitten lapped at it slowly. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "We'll call you Junie," he said at last, "just for tonight." But something in the way she settled between Max and Duke told him tonight would not be the end. By the third morning, the kitten had begun to move with purpose. Her steps were still unsure on the hardwood floor, but they carried a new kind of determination. She no longer flinched at every creak of the old farmhouse or hid beneath the kitchen table when the kettle whistled. Instead, she watched the rhythm of life unfold between Max and Duke and seemed to decide that she, too, had a place within it. Junie, as Walter had started calling her without ceremony, had a coat that had fluffed out since that first wet night, revealing a subtle ripple of silver and ash along her spine. Her tail, once curled tightly for warmth, now waved gently when she moved, like a question half-formed. Her eyes followed everything with an intensity beyond her size. She watched Max and Duke when they sat by the door before their morning walk. She watched Walter sip his bitter coffee from a mug that read, "Montana State Fair, 1982" in faded red. She watched the sun climb its slow path over the frost-glazed hills. It was Max she studied the most. The elder of the pair, Max had a gravitas about him, a silence that was not emptiness but weight. He moved without wasted effort, waited before crossing thresholds, and never barked without reason. Junie mirrored his stillness. When Max paused by the screen door at dawn, Junie did too, sitting squarely beside him, her tiny body tense with curiosity. Duke, on the other hand, treated Junie like a sibling from the start. He dropped toys at her feet, circled her playfully, and even nudged pieces of kibble toward her bowl when he thought Walter wasn't looking. Junie's first attempts at play were clumsy. She pounced too soon, misjudged her footing, and once fell off the couch trying to chase Duke's wagging tail. But she didn't cry. She climbed back up and tried again. And the next time, she landed squarely on his shoulder and let out a sound that was more chirp than meow, but close enough to a victory bark. Walter noticed. He hadn't meant to, but he did. From the far corner of the kitchen, he watched her line up beside the dogs during feeding time. She didn't meow impatiently. She sat, still and poised, until he placed the bowls down, then glanced at Max before taking the first bite. It was a small thing, but it caught at something inside him he thought had gone numb. One morning, as the first true snow began to fall outside, Walter opened the front door and the cold rushed in like a whispered warning. Max and Duke stood ready, leashes already clipped to their collars. Walter looked down. Junie was there too, sitting between them, her silver fur ruffled by the draft, but her gaze steady. He laughed under his breath. "You planning on joining us, little one?" He didn't expect a response, but Junie stepped forward and waited. Walter stared for a long moment, then reached behind the coat rack and found an old ferret harness that had belonged to a neighbor's pet years ago. He adjusted the straps, gently clipped it around her small body, and attached a thin cord. She didn't resist. She simply walked between the shepherds as if she'd always belonged there. Out in the yard, the snow dusted her back like sugar. Duke bounded ahead, nosing through drifts, while Max trotted in his usual path along the fence. Junie kept to the center, her pace careful but constant, her head held high. A car passed by the road, its driver slowing just enough to take in the sight of a cat walking on a leash between two large German shepherds. Walter couldn't help but grin. For the first time in years, he grinned. Inside again, Walter warmed his hands by the stove, while Junie curled up near Max's tail. Duke stretched out across the living room rug, his tongue lolling from the side of his mouth. The quiet was different now. Not the heavy, hollow kind that had filled the house since the fire. This quiet felt full, like a space being knitted back together, stitch by stitch. Later that week, Walter brought out a small bell that had once hung above his late wife's easel. It had long since stopped ringing, its clapper rusted. He placed it on the windowsill above the sink. Junie noticed it immediately. She leapt onto the counter, sniffed at the bell, then sat down as if guarding it. Walter watched her. "She used to ring that when she wanted tea," he murmured. Junie didn't turn her head, but her ears flicked in acknowledgement. By now, the cat didn't just live in the house. She belonged to it. Walter didn't say it out loud, but the way he lingered longer at the doorway when leaving for the store, or how he brought back a small pack of salmon treats with the dog food, said it for him. And the way Junie responded said even more. When he returned from errands, she met him at the door. When he coughed through the night, she climbed onto his chest and lay there until he quieted. She was learning from the dogs, but more than that, she was teaching something too. Something about how even the smallest creature, when given space to try, could choose love. And in that old farmhouse where grief had made a nest, something new was beginning to stir. The days shortened quickly in Elmridge as December crept in with quiet footsteps. Frost spread across the windows like delicate lacework each morning, and the farmhouse seemed to breathe differently in the cold, as though remembering something long buried. The fire stayed lit most of the day now, and Walter moved more slowly, his steps deliberate, his hands more often in his pockets as if the weight of the past had returned with the cold. Walter Briggs hadn't spoken of love since the fire, not to the men at the feed store, not to the old friends who left voicemails he never returned, not even to the dogs who had stood vigil by his side in silence. Max and Duke understood without asking. They had stopped barking at the door, stopped chasing after cars. Their energy turned inward, into stillness and watching. And now, Junie was learning that same stillness, though hers had a different edge, curious and alert, as if trying to decipher the silence that lingered in the corners of the house. Walter often found her watching him from the kitchen counter or the windowsill near the front door. Her amber eyes followed him when he stirred his coffee or stared too long at the worn photo of his daughter tucked behind a magnet on the fridge. He never told her to stop. He couldn't. Because somewhere deep down, that quiet gaze was the only thing in the house that asked him to keep going. One evening, a knock came at the door. It was a sound that had grown rare in the farmhouse, and Walter stiffened in his chair. Max and Duke rose immediately, alert but not alarmed. Junie, already perched on the windowsill, flicked her tail once before hopping down and trotting toward the door. Walter opened it slowly. Carol Weston stood on the porch, her gray hair neatly tied in a bun, her cheeks pink from the wind. She was 68, slim, and always impeccably dressed, even for a neighborly visit. Carol had lived 2 properties down for nearly 20 years, and though she had once shared laughter over coffee with Walter's late wife, she now mostly came by with casseroles and subtle judgments. "I brought pumpkin bread," she said, handing over a foil-wrapped loaf. "Still warm. I used nutmeg this time." Her voice was polite but clipped. Walter took it with a quiet nod and stepped back to let her in. She didn't hesitate. Inside, she looked around the living room with pursed lips. Junie sat upright beside Max, who lay with his head resting on his paws. Duke circled once before, settling near the fireplace. "That's the cat, I presume?" Carol said, narrowing her eyes. Walter said nothing. "I've seen her out there," Carol continued, "walking with the dogs. She waits by the porch, lines up like she's part of the unit. It's peculiar." Walter placed the bread on the counter and leaned on it with both hands. "She is part of the unit," he said. His voice was low but steady. Carol folded her arms. "It isn't right. A cat shouldn't behave like that. She's confused, Walter. You're encouraging something unnatural." Walter turned toward her slowly. His face held no anger, only weariness. "You ever lost everyone in a single night, Carol?" he asked. "You ever stood in the ruins of your own life and wondered why you were left behind?" Carol blinked, lips parting slightly. "No," she admitted after a long pause. "I did," Walter said. "And for months after, this house was so quiet it felt like dying a second time. Then came the dogs, and I remembered routine. Then came Junie, and I remembered warmth." He looked down at the silver kitten now resting against Max's flank. "She's not pretending to be anything. She's just surviving in the only way she knows, same as the rest of us." Carol looked down too. Junie's eyes met hers. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of understanding too quick to grasp. Carol sighed, adjusting her scarf. "You always were a stubborn man." Walter almost smiled. "And you were always too polite to say it outright." She stepped toward the door. "I'll be going then. Keep the bread warm." As she turned the knob, she paused. "Just don't forget, she's still a cat." Walter looked back at Junie, who now stretched across Max's back like she belonged there. "No," he said softly, "but she knows what family feels like." That night, as the fire dimmed and the wind whispered across the rooftop, Walter sat on the couch with a blanket over his knees. Max snored beside him. Duke dreamed with his paws twitching. Junie lay curled on Walter's lap, her body warm and rhythmic with breath. He rested one hand on her side and closed his eyes. "I don't say it much," he whispered, "but I'm glad you're here." She didn't stir, but she pressed her small head against his palm. And somehow, in the stillness of that room, something long frozen inside Walter's chest began to melt. The snow began falling just after dusk, soft and steady at first, as if winter were whispering its arrival rather than shouting it. By the time Walter set a kettle on the stove, the wind had picked up, sweeping down from the hills behind the farmhouse and rattling the loose edges of the roof like impatient fingers. The forecast had mentioned a cold front, but no one in Elmridge expected a full storm, least of all Walter Briggs, who had seen enough winters to know when one was different. Inside the house, the fire flickered gently in the hearth. Max and Duke lay stretched out on the living room rug, their ears occasionally twitching at the sounds outside. Junie, now noticeably larger than the bundle of fur she once was, sat on the back of the couch, her eyes fixed on the swirling white beyond the window. She had grown more confident in the past few weeks, more attuned to the rhythms of the house and the moods that lingered in its corners. Walter moved slowly that evening. He had spent the afternoon stacking firewood, clearing a path to the barn, and checking on the generator in case the power failed. The work had left him more exhausted than he admitted. His joints ached, his vision blurred now and then, and he had skipped lunch without realizing. He poured himself a cup of tea but left it on the counter, forgotten as he sat down beside the fire with a blanket tucked over his legs. The storm strengthened outside, snow piling quickly along the windowsills, wind howling like a wounded animal. Inside, time seemed to slow. Junie jumped down from the couch and circled Walter once before hopping onto his lap. He murmured something soft and unintelligible, his hand resting gently on her back. Max lifted his head. Duke stirred, nose twitching. The room fell still. Then came the slip. Walter shifted to stand, perhaps to stoke the fire or reach for his tea, but as he pushed himself up, his body buckled. His knees gave way, his arms faltered, and he crumpled to the floor with a heavy, graceless thud. The sound jolted the dogs upright. Junie leapt back in alarm, but only for a breath. She landed beside him, her ears flattened and her eyes wide. Walter lay on his side, one arm twisted beneath him, his face pale and damp with sweat. His breathing was shallow, erratic. Junie leaned close, sniffing his cheek, then his chest. She let out a soft, questioning sound, a half purr, half whine, and nudged his hand. There was no response. She looked to Max, who had come closer now, nudging Walter with his broad muzzle, whining low in his throat. Duke circled anxiously, his nails clicking against the hardwood. Then Junie did something unexpected. She ran to the old coffee table, leapt onto it with surprising force, and knocked Walter's cell phone to the floor. It clattered loudly but remained unlit. She pawed at it, mewed sharply, then turned back to Walter, her body taut with urgency. She bit gently at his sleeve, tugging it once, then again, nothing. She stepped back, ears up, and made a strange sound, one Walter had only heard her use when a stranger approached the house, a shrill, fractured cry, somewhere between a chirp and a bark. It filled the room like an alarm. Max responded immediately, letting out a deep, urgent bark. Duke joined him, dashing toward the back door and barking in rapid bursts. The sound pierced the storm, echoing down the empty road. 300 yards away, on the other side of the tree line, a truck rumbled into view. Its headlights cut through the snow like blades. Tom Ellison, a local fireman and Walter's nearest neighbor, had been meaning to check on him since afternoon. Tom was 28, lean and freckled, with a strong jaw and a calm presence that made people feel safe. He had grown up in Elmridge, knew every barn and ditch by memory, and had been raised by a grandmother who believed in checking on neighbors even when they said they were fine. He saw the light flickering strangely through Walter's front window and then heard the barking. Something tightened in his chest. He parked fast and sprinted through the snowdrift to the front porch. The door was unlocked. Inside, the barking stopped the moment he entered. Tom found Walter on the floor, unconscious, with Max pressed against his side and Junie crouched beside his chest. Duke barked once, then fell silent, as if handing over responsibility. Tom rushed to Walter, checked his pulse, then pulled his phone from his coat. "This is Ellison. I've got a medical emergency at 42 Timberline Drive, Ive. Elder male, collapsed. Possible stroke or diabetic episode." As he spoke, he felt Junie's eyes on him, wide and unblinking. He looked at her for a long second, then said, quieter, "You called for help, didn't you?" Not a real question, but a strange kind of acknowledgement. The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later. Walter was stabilized, still unconscious but breathing. Tom stayed until they loaded him into the ambulance. Max refused to leave Walter's side and had to be gently pulled away. Duke whined the entire time. Junie stayed back, trembling, but did not hide. As the red lights disappeared into the storm, Tom turned to the little cat standing beside the doorway, her body trembling but her eyes steady. "You're a strange one," he said, "but I think he owes you his life." And for the first time since the snow had begun to fall, the farmhouse fell quiet again. Walter came home 3 days after the storm. The hospital released him with instructions to rest, eat regularly, and avoid exertion. He didn't argue, though he rarely followed advice. His steps were slower now, more deliberate, and his hands trembled slightly when he reached for the railing. Max and Duke flanked him as he crossed the threshold, their tails wagging cautiously, unsure if celebration was allowed. Junie trotted ahead of them, her head held high, tail curved like a proud flag. The farmhouse, once a place of quiet and dust, now hummed with a strange new energy. Word of what had happened traveled fast through Elmridge. In a town that measured news by snowfall and school closures, the story of an old man saved by his dogs and his cat became something larger than gossip. By the end of the week, someone had written about it in the Elmridge Chronicle, the local paper printed every Thursday and delivered by hand to 100 homes and the post office bulletin board. The headline read, "Cat alerts dogs. Dogs alert town. Walter Briggs saved by his unlikely pack." At first, Walter was irritated. He hadn't asked to be written about. He certainly hadn't expected neighbors stopping by, knocking on his door with casseroles and questions. They came bundled in scarves and curiosity. Some brought bags of treats. Others came just to see Junie. One little boy with red mittens asked if she could do tricks. She didn't. She just blinked at him and walked off. Carol Weston came too. She didn't bring bread this time. She brought a folded newspaper and a tray of beef stew. She didn't mention their last conversation. Instead, she sat quietly in Walter's kitchen, watching Junie nuzzle into Max's fur while Duke snored under the table. "She's changed you," Carol said softly. Walter didn't look up from his bowl. "Or maybe she just reminded you that you weren't done yet." Walter didn't respond at first. Then he said, "It's not just her, it's all of them. They keep pulling me back from the edge." Carol nodded and left without pressing further. That, too, was new. In the weeks that followed, winter pressed down harder, but the farmhouse did not return to silence. People dropped by with firewood, soup, or simply to say they were glad he was still around. Junie, now firmly woven into the rhythm of the household, became its quiet pulse. She followed Walter into the kitchen, waited by the door with Max and Duke when it was time for a walk, and slept at his feet when he dozed in the recliner. One morning, a woman from the Elmridge Gazette, a different paper with a slightly wider reach, called to ask for an interview. Walter declined. But later that afternoon, he sat with a notepad and tried to write the story himself. He wanted to get it right, if only for himself. But when he looked at the page, all he wrote was one line. "She didn't save me. She reminded me I was worth saving. It was around this time that Junie began accompanying Walter to the barn. The building was old but sturdy, its rafters dusted with frost, the air inside smelling of hay and motor oil. Walter would open the wide door each morning to let light spill in, and Junie would walk beside him, silent and watchful. Sometimes she chased mice. Other times she sat in the loft window and blinked at the sun. Once, she startled a hawk perched on the fence post, sending it fleeing with a hiss that was louder than any bark. Junie didn't act like a dog. Not really. But she didn't act like any cat Walter had ever known either. She had a stillness that felt more like loyalty than indifference. She didn't seek attention. She just stayed. And when Walter's breathing grew labored after chores, she was always the first to touch his knee with a paw, as if anchoring him to the world. One Saturday, a small group of elementary school kids arrived with their teacher, Miss Rachel Dean, a cheerful woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and a bright scarf knotted loosely around her neck. She explained that they were doing a community kindness project and wanted to meet the famous cat who acts like a dog. Walter chuckled, not because it was funny, but because he couldn't believe it had come to this. He invited them inside, offered cocoa, and sat on the edge of his chair as the children gathered on the rug. Max and Duke stretched out lazily, while Junie perched on the arm of the couch like a queen. One child asked if she would bark. Another asked if she had been trained. Walter looked at them all and said, "She just pays attention. That's how she learned." A little girl raised her hand. "Did she know you were sick?" Walter paused. "I think she knew I needed help, and she didn't wait to be told." Miss Dean nodded quietly, her eyes full. When the children left, one of them left behind a drawing of Junie with a cape and a gold star. Walter pinned it to the fridge. That night, with the fire glowing and the house full of quiet breathing, Walter looked around at his strange, beautiful household. A cat who didn't purr much but pressed her head to his hand when he was tired. Two dogs who guarded him like he was something worth protecting. He never thought life would look like this. He never thought it could again. But here it was. A family, strange and stitched together from broken parts, whole in all the places that mattered. By the time the snow began to melt, it did so without drama. No great thaw, no roaring runoff, just a quiet surrender. Ice dripped from the barn roof in steady rhythm, and the earth, long hidden under layers of silence and frost, exhaled with the scent of moss and softened soil. The first robin appeared on a Tuesday. Junie saw it before anyone else. She didn't chase it. She simply sat by the window, her ears still and forward, as though watching the world begin again. Walter Briggs stood on the porch steps that morning, a thermos of weak coffee in hand, wrapped in a canvas jacket 2 sizes too big. His color had returned, though his frame remained thinner than it had been before the storm. The quiet no longer frightened him. Instead, it had become a kind of background music to days that were now fuller, marked by motion and memory. The old farmhouse, however, had not fared so well. The water line in the kitchen had burst during the deep freeze, warping the floor and staining the walls. A second inspection confirmed what Walter already suspected. The house was no longer safe to live in. The porch sagged on one side. The roof had bowed above the back bedroom. There was talk of demolition come summer. Walter didn't protest. He didn't have the fight in him. What surprised everyone, including himself, was the offer from Carol Weston. She came one morning holding a paper coffee cup in one hand and an old key in the other. "Spare room's got heat," she said simply, "and I bought a scratching post." He stared at her. She looked back with her usual sternness, only now softened by the faintest tilt at the corner of her mouth. "Only for a few days," she added, "until you figure out where to go." They stayed 2 weeks. Carol, meticulous and neat, allowed Max and Duke to take over her rug and permitted Junie to perch atop her bookshelves, even when the cat knocked over her prized glass hummingbird. "It's just a thing," Carol muttered, though she dusted up the pieces with unnecessary care. One evening, a call came from a woman named Helen Dorr, a friend of Carol's from her church knitting group. Helen was 74, short and broad-shouldered, with a warm, dusky voice and a gentle humor that always lingered a beat after her words. She spoke of a couple she knew, Frank and Marlene Wyatt, both in their 70s, who were moving to New Mexico to be closer to their children. They had a cabin near Alder Lake, a place with pine trees and a long wooden dock, and were looking for someone to care for it, someone quiet, someone trustworthy. "They want to meet you," Carol told Walter that night, setting the address down on the counter beside a plate of butter cookies she swore she didn't bake for him. "I told them you don't talk much. They liked that." Walter drove out the next morning, the truck loaded with only what mattered. The dogs, Junie, a flannel blanket, a photo of his daughter tucked into the glove compartment. The lake shimmered like a sheet of old glass beneath low gray skies. The cabin sat at the edge of the water, its beams sun-worn, its porch sagging with charm rather than damage. Frank was tall and rail-thin with calloused hands and a voice like dry leaves. Marlene had soft gray curls and wore wool sweaters with embroidered robins on the front. They spoke in warm turns, asking almost nothing. They listened to everything. Junie circled the cabin's living room once, then leapt onto the windowsill and curled her tail around her paws. Max settled by the hearth. Duke sniffed the stairs, then lay down with a sigh. Marlene watched the scene with moist eyes. "It already feels like someone lives here," she whispered. By April, they had moved in for good. Walter patched the porch, replaced a screen door, and built a ramp for Junie that led from the bookshelf to the top of the kitchen cabinets. He planted marigolds in wooden crates and let the dogs roam the shore at dusk. Junie stayed close, always close, walking between Max and Duke like she had never known anything different. That summer, a woman named Gloria Stone, director of a local veterans writing group, came to visit after reading about Walter's story in the county journal. She arrived with a binder and a camera crew. Walter refused the interview but allowed them to meet Junie. Gloria stayed for tea. She left a note behind that read, "Healing doesn't always come in straight lines. Sometimes it walks on 4 feet, sometimes 3. Later that year, Walter began allowing small groups from the nearby senior center to visit. Not every week, just sometimes. They came with careful steps and hopeful hearts. Junie greeted them with grace. She pressed her forehead to trembling hands, sat beside oxygen tanks and wheelchairs without fear, and always, always returned to Walter's side when the visits were done. Each night, the house settled into its new rhythm. The lake turned black beneath the stars. The breeze moved gently through the pine trees. Inside, Max lay by the door, Duke curled near the couch. Junie rested on Walter's chest, her breath a soft echo of his own. He no longer wondered why he had been left behind. He knew now that sometimes the ones who survive are not the strongest, but the ones with something left to give. And in this strange, stitched-together life, he had found something to give again. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it comes softly, on quiet paws, in the shape of those who simply stay when we need them most. Junie never asked to be a hero. She only knew how to belong and how to give. In a world that often measures worth by appearance or labels, she reminded us that family is built on presence, not pedigree. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, consider staying with us for the next one. You never know what quiet miracle might be waiting just around the bend.